Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first event of the new year for the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. My name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the Council and your host for tonight's program. We're so excited to have you here with us live online as we continue to manage the pandemic, and we hope to be able to bring some in-person events in the coming year. We are so excited to be presenting tonight's event, Rejoining the Global Community, Breaking Down the Biden Foreign Policy. But before I introduce our panelists, I would like to mention a few things. First off, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization, and our goal is to educate people about complex global issues. We do this through a number of programs, our speakers programs, our international visitor exchanges, and our global trivia challenge for high school students through the World Affairs Councils of America. Of course, 2020 was a challenging year for the organization and for everyone, but we were able to survive and thrive in this new environment. So again, thank you to everyone who is joining us here live, as well as to those who will be watching the recording of this later. We also would like to make mention that as a nonpartisan organization, we do not support or endorse any particular candidate, issue, policy, or party. The information here tonight is for your use. We are simply a platform to help you engage with expert speakers on these complex global issues. We hope that you take the information you hear tonight and form your own opinions about the subject matter. In addition, I would like to thank our various supporters, donors, and members who make our work possible. This includes our mission partner, Southern New Hampshire University, our lead series sponsor, Karen and Steve Barndollar, as well as Helen Taft, Peter Bowman, Janet Prince, and Peter Berg. All of you have been wonderful supporters of our organization and of these programs, and we really appreciate what you do to help us make these programs possible. Speaking of membership, I would like to now bring on Karen and Steve Barndollar to talk a little bit about why they are members and why they believe you might want to join as well.
Hello, my name is Steve Barndollar, and my wife Karen is here with me, and my son Gil sitting out of the screen. I'm on the board of directors at World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and our executive director Tim Horgan has asked me to say a few words as to why we have become members, and more recently a board member in the last year. And for me, that's easy. We've traveled internationally. I worked overseas for a number of years. All have been involved in international business, and moved back to the Seacoast, specifically Portsmouth, 1982. And both of my children and my son particularly have been involved in our business, was export business. The council, I think, gives people, granted staters, a chance to engage with the world, as the motto says, and bring New Hampshire to the world and the world to New Hampshire. There's a vast array of materials, more recently on podcasts, a virtual thing, and I enjoy working with the committees of the World Affairs Council that I'm on. There's specifically to talk about the work the council does, and I'm going through this venture to encourage you as New Hampshire granted staters to join the council, add your support, and be part of the internationalization of our communities. It's been a great experience. And Tim and his staff of 4 people at Southern New Hampshire University do a great job of collating, putting the materials together, and bringing quality speakers to our listeners. If you go on our website, you can go through the programs, look at the current speakers. We did over 30 events, speaking events on podcasts last year, 2020. We have approximately 220 members, supporting members. We'd love to have more students and younger younger members join us. It's an active board, and there is an event coming up, interesting event. One of the groups that programs that we have developed, and Tim has developed over the last 5 years, has been the Academic World Quest for high school students. And the first group meeting, the group testing, because they compete with each other on questions, is taking place on March 7th. So you can go online to look at that. Events that we have continuously of those 30 events annually are the Global Tipping Points and the Global Forum, featuring people like Secretary Chuck Hagel last fall and William Perry speaking events. So there's a variety of information. We're so happy you're here tonight. I encourage you to join the council, and I'll have my wife say a few words if she would. Karen.
Ms. Karen Barndauer. I was born in Germany and lived in a few European countries and the Middle East before I came to the States. I actually came across the World Affairs Council initially quite a few years ago now, when I worked with the previous executive director on a couple of international events in Portsmouth. My personal feeling is that the United States is still a superpower, and it's very important that its citizens understand and know the world beyond its borders. Through the work that the council does, whether it's the speaking program or the international visitors program, which unfortunately is currently on hold, it introduces and brings the world to New Hampshire, as you all said. And in a small, homogeneous state like this, it's particularly important that people be exposed, and high schoolers and school children in particular be exposed to what lies beyond our little state of New Hampshire here.
Thanks so much, Karen and Steve. We really appreciate all you do to support the council and help make our program successful. As we move through the evening tonight, we would like to encourage you to send in your questions for our speakers. We will have a moderated Q&A session a bit later, but you can reach out to us in a couple of ways. First, if you are on our website, you can click on the little icon in the bottom right-hand corner and use our chat function there to send us your questions. If you're on any of our social media channels, we'll be monitoring those throughout the evening. And if you send us your questions there, we'll be sure to try and get them answered as well. Finally, if you prefer, you can email us at council@wacnh.org. We really hope to get through as many questions as we can tonight and have a really robust conversation. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two wonderful speakers for the evening, Dr. Emma Ashford and Dr. James Goldgeier. Dr. Ashford is a resident senior fellow with the New American Engagement Initiative in the Snowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. She has expertise in the politics of Russia, Europe, and the Middle East, focusing on grand strategy, international security, and the future of U.S. foreign policy. A perfect background for tonight's discussion. She also has founded and co-hosted the Power Problems podcast. She's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and holds a PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. Dr. Goldgeier is a Robert Bosch Senior Visiting Fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, as well as a professor of international affairs at American University. He served on the National Security Council for Russian, Ukrainian, and European affairs, and has worked for many of the top international think tanks in Washington, D.C. Too many to list here tonight, but you can see his bio on our website. Finally, he co-directs the Bridging the Gap project, a program designed to help scholars develop policy-relevant reports on global challenges and U.S. foreign policy. I would like now to turn things over to Emma for her remarks.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you this evening. And I'm really excited about the topic. I think, the start of a new administration is always one of those times when we sort of look at a new administration, we say, what are they going to do in foreign policy? And often, more often than not, I think there's a lot of continuity and very little change. This is one of those occasions, though, where that's not necessarily the case. The Trump administration was, in many ways, an aberration in US foreign policy. There was a lot of continuity, but there were some things that were wildly outside the norm in US foreign policy. So considering what Joe Biden is going to do in foreign policy, I think is really important as we look at the next 4 years. So I thought I would basically just give sort of 4 or 5 big points about where I think the Biden administration's priorities are, where I think they're going, and where they might differ from the Trump administration. So my first point would be that I think Biden is promising something very simple in foreign policy. He is promising what you might call restorationism, or, if I could borrow a phrase, he's promising to make American foreign policy great again. Not quite as good an acronym, but it's a great slogan. He's giving a speech last week at the Munich Security Council. The first line of the speech was, "America is back, and we're looking towards the future. We're not looking towards the past." So what Biden is promising is a return to the foreign policy status quo prior to Donald Trump. And as sort of a sub-part of that, I think he's also promising a return to competence in foreign policy. And one key difference between the next 4 years and the last 4 years is going to be that whatever you may think of Joe Biden's policies, and I disagree with many of them, they will at least be carried out in a moderately competent way with a staff of experts that knows what they're doing, which differentiates it quite strongly from what we saw during the Trump era. Second point, there's going to be a very noticeable shift from the Trump administration in terms of tone, and a somewhat smaller shift in terms of substance. So we have already seen this shift in tone. We've seen the Biden administration repeatedly praise US allies, talk about its partnerships around the world, recommit to US commitments, verbally at least. We've seen them talk about human rights. We've seen senior officials in the administration respond to human rights issues that the Trump administration might have ignored. But on the substance, there is somewhat less of a shift. The Biden administration has not pursued major changes in US alliances, for example. On the human rights front, most of the changes so far have been verbal. And if we look at some of the sort of policies that they're proposing, for example, the Summit of Democracies that has been mooted and is being sort of discussed in the administration, that right now is very much a tone issue. It's about public relations. It's about communicating that America is trying to stand up for democracy. There is much less of a real agenda underlying that policy. So again, tone versus substance. Thus far, we're not entirely clear how far the substance is going to shift from the Trump administration. The third point, on the question of America's forever wars, or as a lot of progressives in the Democratic Party put it, ending endless war, which was the slogan that propped up a lot during the Democratic primary on the question of foreign policy. Biden has been somewhat receptive to those calls. We have already seen the administration take steps to end support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen, and this is I think an excellent policy. That was a war that had really no bearing on U.S. interests, but was actively creating a humanitarian crisis. And it seems like pressure from progressive anti-war left groups has really had an impact there. And the Biden administration is also reconsidering arms sales to the Gulf states in the context of that conflict. But in the context of Afghanistan, which is another progressive priority, we're seeing a much more mixed message from the Biden administration. So the Biden administration has to decide before May 1st whether they're going to abide by the deal that Donald Trump negotiated with the Taliban. And right now, the sort of leaks that we're seeing from inside the administration suggest that they are not planning to follow through on that. And that in turn is sort of an approach that I think many in the progressive left of the party would not favor. So on that question of Middle Eastern wars, the war on terror, the Biden administration has so far been quite mixed. A fourth point, the Middle East, the Biden administration's Middle East policies look fairly different from the Trump administrations, at least within sort of limits. US relations with Saudi Arabia have been not necessarily fraught, but have been far less friendly since Biden came into office. And we've seen the Saudis try to sort of curry some favor by releasing dissidents, and we've also seen, as I said earlier, those arms sales being halted. So that relationship is far less friendly than it was under Trump, even if its fundamentals remain basically unchanged. The same with Israel. The Trump administration had an extremely close relationship with Israel, to the extent that they often prioritized not just the needs of Israel, but the needs of the Netanyahu government over US interests in a number of cases. The Biden administration, well, again, it hasn't taken any affirmative steps to sort of end some of those policies, has been much colder towards the Israeli government, not calling Netanyahu, for example, until over a week into the Biden presidency. And then when it comes to Iran, we had expected to see a fairly sizable shift from the Biden administration on rejoining the JCPOA, reopening relations with Iran. And what we've actually seen in practice is that is probably going to happen. The appointments that have been made to the administration suggest that they are planning to pursue diplomacy with Iran, but there seems to be more of an internal debate over the form those negotiations should take than we might have expected. So there's some noises coming out of the administration that they may not simply rejoin the JCPOA, they may seek to reopen those negotiations. And again, that is somewhat of a continuation of Trump's policies, as opposed to we thought it would be a total change. A fifth point, the one Trump policy that is here to stay is Washington's favorite new buzzword, and that's great power competition with China and Russia. Now, we can debate all day the utility of that phrase, great power competition. It's never well defined. It's not really clear what it means. But many in Washington are now convinced that we are engaged in a struggle with China and Russia and other revisionist states, and that we need to sort of improve things here in America. We need to improve our defensive edge in order to compete effectively. This is where the debate is centered in Washington. And everything that we have seen so far from the new Biden administration suggests that they are going to maintain and expand upon that plank of the Trump administration's policy. So appointments to the National Security Council, to the Department of Defense, the State Department, are relatively hawkish on China. We've seen freedom of navigation exercises continue in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. We've seen the Biden administration signal it's going to keep some of Trump's trade restrictions on China. It's probably not going to be as erratic a China policy as the Trump administration pursued, but it looks like it will, in most major areas, be very similar. So that's one area of substantial continuity between Trump and the Biden administration, and one that has some serious and potential dangers for US national security down the road if we push too far in the wrong direction on this policy. And then I guess a sixth and final point, and I'll wrap up here because I want you to hear from Jim, and then I want to hear your questions. But I would raise the question, just pose a question here, which is Biden capable of delivering what he promises in foreign policy? And it's not clear to me that he can. He has promised restorationism. He has promised to take American foreign policy back to where it was during the Obama administration or before, promised to restore America to its preeminent leadership role in the world. And the world has moved on in the last 4 years. And it's not clear to me that Biden can actually achieve that promise when he faces a world that is more problematic in terms of countries like China and Russia, and more skeptical in terms of US allies and how they perceive the US and its reliability. So with that, I will wrap up and turn it over to Jim.
Well, great. Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation from the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, and grateful to the Barn Dollars and the other supporters of these programs. It's terrific that you're so engaged, and always great to hear what Emma has to say. I always learn so much from her. And I will try to be brief because, as she said, we really want to get to your questions. I have three buckets of comments, and one is this issue of America is back. So there's some overlap there. I'll cut that down to concentrate on the other two areas that did not come up in Emma's remarks. But this, what does it mean that America's back? So far as we've seen, it primarily means rejoining international agreements like the Paris Climate Accords, institutions, organizations like the World Health Organization, and most importantly, recommitting to alliances, especially NATO and the US alliances in Asia, which are seen as key to the strategic competition that Emma was talking about. That part strikes me as pretty clear, as she said. Whether or not sort of America's back means going back to the foreign policy prior to 2017, remains to be seen. But it's pretty clear what they mean by that. The administration has also argued that its organizing principle in foreign policy is that it's pursuing a foreign policy for the middle class. This was something that they talked about a lot during the campaign, and several high-level officials, including National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, worked on a project with that title before coming into office. And that sounds great. Having a foreign policy for the middle class. I think the roots of that are really go back to the Trump victory in 2017 with an establishment that believes in the importance of American engagement and saw the Trump victory and thought, well, wait, why is the American population not seeming to support the historical American policy of engagement? If we're going to recreate a engagement policy in the world, then we need to make it clear that this foreign policy serves the middle class. I think so far this is a little less clear to me. I mean, they certainly, when President Biden went to the State Department to give his speech, he mentioned foreign policy for the middle class, and it was also mentioned in remarks that same day by Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan. But what does it mean in practice? There are a lot of issues where it's really not clear what the connection is to the middle class. And also because the foreign policy for the middle class and America's back can actually come into conflict with one another at times. So, for example, if America's back means rebuilding, revitalizing America's alliances, but a foreign policy for the middle class means pursuing economic policies that might be unpopular with key allies like Germany and Japan. This is something that has historically been the case. Well, what happens when you have those kinds of tensions? And how do those get resolved? And it's also just a general challenge of tying everything to this idea of the foreign policy for the middle class, because a lot of issues, no matter how you talk about them, it's going to be hard for people to understand how they affect the middle class. So, for example, it's been very important for the administration to talk about human rights in Myanmar and opposition to the military coup there. Well, how do you tie an issue like that back to what's going on in the United States, or even ending offensive operations in Yemen? Also is an important issue for the administration. But I think the biggest foreign policy challenge that Joe Biden faces is convincing other countries, and especially U.S. allies, that the policies he institutes will stick after January 20th of 2025. We saw Barack Obama join the Paris Climate Accords. Donald Trump walked away from the Paris Climate Accords. Joe Biden has rejoined the Paris Climate Accords. Well, what's to stop the next president from walking away? How does President Biden convince other countries that the United States can maintain a steady course? This is not really up to him alone, or even up to the executive branch alone. It is highly dependent, most of all, I would argue, on whether the U.S. Congress can ever again play a strong role in foreign policy as the founders intended. We have seen some members, like, for example, Senator Ben Sasse, talking a lot about this in recent weeks, about the importance of Congress regaining its role in foreign policy. This is going to be challenging. A primary feature of the post-Cold War world has been an increasingly unconstrained presidency when it comes to foreign policy. And that's come about largely because of the decreasing congressional oversight and decreasing congressional expertise over the last 3 decades in foreign policy. How will Congress go about reclaiming that? What we've seen over recent decades is that presidents have jealously taken prerogatives for themselves, and they haven't liked to have a lot of congressional interference. They argue that the White House has certain prerogatives, which is true, but I think Joe Biden has an interest in seeing a strengthened Congress, because it's only with a stronger Congress that there will be greater reassurance that the policies he's pursuing won't be overturned in 4 years. And as I watch things unfold, that's one of the major aspects that I will be watching closely. So, the idea that America's back, the idea that it's pursuing a foreign policy for middle class, are, to me, the big ticket items in the Biden foreign policy. As Emma mentioned, strategic competition is a major organizing principle, and in that regard, Joe Biden has talked a lot about democracies versus autocracies. We can also, in talking about America's back, put it in the context of a re-emphasis on diplomacy again. But I would argue that all of these things, in terms of lasting beyond this administration, if there is a change in party again in the White House in 4 years, that much of the ultimate success of Joe Biden's administration, and I would argue future administrations, will rest on the ability of Congress to play its constitutionally designated role.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Jim and Emma, for your insights. I think this is a great starting point for us. And yes, please do continue to send in your questions. We will get to as many of them as we can. But since, Jim, you ended with this idea of America is back and all that stuff, I like this question here of, even if the world is skeptical that America is back, who would take on the role of the world leader in foreign affairs? So in other words, if not us, who? And I think this can also be taken from the point of view of, when America steps back from the world, does that leave a vacuum, and who takes over in those scenarios? So Jim, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Emma.
Okay, yes. I mean, there's only one country that can play the role of global leader, and that is the United States. Other countries are not as powerful and are not able to play that kind of role. And, there certainly has been the argument out there. For example, my Brookings colleague, Bob Kagan, his book, The Jungle Grows Back. The theme of that book during the Trump years was, when America pulls back from its role, then that jungle out there grows back. And it's only America that helps provide for some kind of international order where there's respect for democracy, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. I think the challenge for the United States as a global leader, and the United States has that important role of a global leader, but not the global leader that it was in the 1990s. The United States in its history has gone from a century and a half where it was apart from the world, basically, to a period where it sat atop the world, to the coming era when it is more amidst the world. It has to define its leadership differently. In the 1990s, it could just tell everybody else what to do. And countries like China and Russia couldn't really push back. That's not the case anymore. And so that really is going to require much more deft diplomacy. And, Emma talked about the great competence of this administration. They have hugely talented people, and, they're quite good at diplomacy, but it's a very different world situation than it was. And the question, gets at this critical point of how can the U.S. be a global leader, even if it's not the global leader that it was in the 1990s.
Yeah, so I actually agree with basically everything that Jim said there. I think it's really important to remember how much of an aberration the last 30 years have been in world history. America emerged from the Cold War as, the unipolar power, the one country that was able to, as Jim said, it was able to sort of seize world leadership that was so powerful that other states didn't really challenge it. And thanks to shifts in the balance of power, right? A rising China, a rising India, Europe is strengthening financially, America's in relative decline. That world doesn't really exist anymore. And so, I think the challenge for the Biden administration, and it is a massive challenge, is to learn how America goes from world leadership as we construe it, from sort of a presidency, right, of one man, one country standing above the rest, to more of a, parliamentary or communal system where we are perhaps first among equals, but other countries play an increasingly large role in how the world functions and in how we solve sort of difficult global problems. And I think, ensuring that we land in that multipolar world without ending up in some kind of conflict, that I think is the biggest challenge for US foreign policy in the next couple of decades.
Great. So one of the things, I guess, that could follow on to this is the question here that can the U.S. become a beacon for democracy again by leading the way on democratic backsliding in Europe, Hong Kong, etc. We certainly have seen our own share of democratic backsliding, and would love to hear, we'll start with you, Emma, your thoughts on how the U.S. can regain that global leadership role.
America, I think, has never been perfect in democracy. Even during the Cold War, we did not manage to achieve desegregation and civil rights until a couple of decades into the Cold War, and so it is somewhat of a myth that America has to be perfect at home to be an example abroad. That said, I also think the way that America has approached democracy promotion in the last couple of years, in the last couple of decades, has been just massively damaging to how we approach the issue overall. So everything from the invasion of Iraq to trying to do nation building, democracy promotion in Afghanistan, a response to the Arab Spring, which across the board was basically a disaster. And all of that sort of military approach to democracy promotion has in many ways undermined the more benign forms of democracy promotion that we've historically done, acting as an example, helping other countries helping activists figure out how they can push for rights in their home countries. And so I think this is not an area where the Biden administration should be talking about sort of rebuilding democracy promotion and getting back to being a force for democracy in the world. It's about taking stock and saying, well, how can we rectify the situation that has sort of become just so bad in recent years?
And it's interesting because I think something that President Biden has recognized, because he's said it, is we have to show that our democracy can work. We have to show that government can actually provide for people and help solve the kind of problems that they're facing. When our democracy is gridlocked and when polarization is just overwhelming the system and we're not getting things done, that's what makes it easy for a Xi Jinping in China or Vladimir Putin in Russia to say to their people, would you want to live like that? Would you want to live in that kind of system? I mean, as somebody who definitely wants to live in a democracy and not in an authoritarian state. I mean, I don't want to be a citizen of China or a citizen of Russia. I'm thrilled that I'm an American citizen, but we've got to have a system of government that works. And I think that if we're going to be a beacon of democracy, we have to be able to demonstrate not just our commitment to democratic principles like freedom of the press, and the right to vote for everyone. I mean, the ability of everyone who's eligible to vote to be able to vote. But we have to, we have to have a system that is working for people. And I Emma mentioned earlier, the Biden administration, president mentioned this in his speech at the State Department, that he wants to have a summit for democracy. And I've written about why I think that particular form of an event is the energy for that would be better spent elsewhere. There are a lot of problems with holding that kind of summit, and have argued instead that what we should be trying to do this year is having a summit for democracy here in the United States, and bringing together national and state and local leaders and civil society together to talk about what we can do to strengthen our own democracy here. But I do agree with Emma that we don't have to become perfect before we start talking about democracy abroad. It should be something that we care a lot about, but it's not going to resonate in the rest of the world if we can't get our act together.
And Jim, that plays well into a question that is similar on the topic of the U.S. is trying to rejoin the Human Rights Commission in 2022, and a number of statements have been made about other countries and how they've treated minorities. So one of our questions here asks, and I'm not going to pop it up because it's a little bit on the long side, but just how does the summer and fall, winter of racial justice protests in the U.S. play on the international stage, and what does it mean for the U.S.'s voice as a leader for human rights around the world?
Well, the U.S. does have to show that it can try to move to address systemic racism in the United States. It's interesting, during the Cold War, especially sort of late 40s to Civil Rights Act of 1964, there are a number of studies that have shown that, a lot of what the United States was doing to address civil rights in the United States was by presidents like President Truman and President Eisenhower, that this was being done because of the propaganda war with the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union was making so much hay out of the fact that the United States was treating a part of its population so badly, and was violating its rights, and that people were being lynched and murdered and jailed and not allowed to be full citizens and free of fear. And so that there was movement on civil rights in the United States because there was this competing propaganda that the Soviet Union was putting out that was successful in much of the world. Well, Emma mentioned the strategic competition. I mean, I think we will see, as the United States emphasizes strategic competition with China and Russia more and more, that if you want to be successful in that strategic competition, that means in part that you've got to deal with these issues at home. And this is an administration now that wants to deal with those issues anyway. I mean, it's committed to trying to move forward on those issues, but it's definitely linked to how well we can, what our standing is like in the world. And when we fall short, it's pretty obvious to everybody. And we saw last summer the number of protests around the world, in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd.
And Emma, specifically on the great power competition issue, obviously the Uyghurs in China, Navalny as just one small case in Russia. How does this play on the strategic competition between these countries for global influence?
This is another place, I think, where Biden is really going to have somewhat of a dilemma. In his speeches, both in the campaign and the couple of big foreign policy speeches he's given since coming into office, he has promised simultaneously that the United States is going to be back and protecting human rights and democracy promotion, and we're going to help to protect dissidents. And at the same time, in a speech at the State Department, he said the United States will talk to adversaries as necessary to protect US interests. And there are a lot of places where those two missions for the United States come into conflict. And I think, the question of Navalny is the one that's sort of biggest in a lot of people's minds at the moment. The United States has previously sanctioned Russia over human rights issues. it hasn't done a lot of good. The Kremlin has continued to sort of crack down on dissidents. At the same time, the sanctions have helped to tank US-Russian relations and make it more difficult to talk to them on questions of mutual interest like strategic stability. So, this is a dilemma for most administrations, but I think the Biden administration has really been selling a picture of, America can do both things. And I think there are a lot of places where that's not necessarily possible, Russia perhaps being the key one.
Okay, Jim, we were talking a little bit before we got on here about the back and forth nature of politics and what that has meant for U.S. foreign relations over the past several years. So we have a great question that falls into that. Like the presidency, Congress may seem to flip back and forth from Democrat to Republican with widely different priorities. So do they really play a role in foreign affairs? And then we also have a question that plays into this about what can everyday Americans do to promote an increased role for Congress in foreign policies. Jim, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, those are great questions. Constitutionally, Congress has important roles to play. It is supposed to be the body that declares war. We haven't seen a Congress formally declare war since 1942 in the aftermath of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Presidents have gone to Congress to get congressional support. But for example, the authorization to use military force, is 20 years old. And there's been a lot of talk of Congress revising the authorization to use military force so that in some way constrains the president. But this has proven to be very difficult for members of Congress who often don't want to put themselves in the position where they are involved in those issues. They would rather have the president take whatever heat the president is going to take for the use of military force. Congress has the role to play on trade issues. We know, of course, about the congressional role on confirmations because we're seeing the confirmations, in recent weeks, including for the Secretary of State. So, it provides its advice and consent. And, it also has a role to play, of course, on advice and consent on treaties. And there, perhaps, we see with the Congress the way it is, that it's just unlikely that American presidents are going to go to Congress to forge treaties, because getting 2/3 of the Senate to vote in support of a treaty is extremely difficult to do. The New START Arms Control Treaty was done as a treaty 10 years ago, and it's just increasingly rare to see presidents pursue foreign policy through the treaty process. I think that the most important thing is that Congress, there needs to be congressional expertise on foreign policy, and that declined after the end of the Cold War. We did see a class of new members of Congress in 2018 come in with significant national security experience. Andy Kim and Tom Malinowski from New Jersey, Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan, Abigail Spanberger from Virginia. These are people who had a lot of foreign policy experience before coming in. They're beginning to play a role in Congress. It'll take a while for them to really establish themselves as leaders in Congress, but they're already beginning to serve on these committees and play a role. I think to the extent that you have that expertise and you can have congressional oversight, that's where Congress can really play a role. Members of Congress are responding to their constituents. So if their constituents tell them they care about foreign policy, members of Congress are going to respond. And that is coming back to my earlier point about the foreign policy for the middle class. If Joe Biden is really able to put meat on that and convince people that he's pursuing a foreign policy that is helping the middle class, then that may be a way for members of Congress to engage more on these issues. And yes, Democrats control, then Republicans control, Democrats control, but it's really about Congress as a body, particularly through legislation and through oversight and expertise, playing a steadier role, regardless of whether the majority leader or the Speaker of the House is Democrat or Republican.
Yeah, just to sort of add one thing to that, I think one of the more worrying trends that we've seen in recent years is a trend towards congressional activism only in cases where they want to tie the executive's hands on difficult problems. And so while we have fairly rarely seen Congress try and act on war powers issues, there were a few sort of Yemen-related bills in the last few years, but we've almost never seen Congress try and act on that front. We haven't seen them try to rewrite the AUMF, as Jim mentioned. We haven't seen them try and rein in any of those war powers particularly. But what we have seen a lot of is bills that put new sanctions on other countries and make it harder to remove those sanctions if the president negotiates with them. We've seen bills that try to stop the president, whether it's Obama, whether it's Trump, from withdrawing troops from various theaters. You know, there was one bill related to Syria. There was another related to sort of peacetime troops in Germany. So Congress has got into a pattern where it really only weighs in to try and stop the president doing something they dislike, rather than actually getting involved in decisions that may be more controversial. And that, I think, is a very bad situation to be in. You're basically in the situation, the worst of all worlds, where Congress rarely weighs in, but when they do, it's to make things more difficult for an executive that's trying to change U.S. foreign policy.
Okay, and moving on to the international issue that seemed to take forever to resolve, but finally got resolved, Brexit. So Alan Post asks, how should one expect the US to deal with Brexit? We have important economic and defensive ties with both the UK and the European Union. Emma, we'll take your thoughts first.
Yeah, so I should come clean right up front and note that I'm a dual British-American citizenship, so I have fairly strong feelings about Brexit. But putting that to the side, much of the US-European defense framework at the moment, almost all of it, in fact, is concentrated inside NATO, and the United Kingdom has not withdrawn from NATO. If anything, it remains one of the stronger members in that coalition, in that alliance. And so I do not see any particular defense concerns in the near future from Brexit. What I think may be more interesting is the move among some of the continental European states towards what the French are calling strategic autonomy, but the idea that Europe should have not just a stronger defensive capacity inherent within the European Union, but also that it should have decision-making capabilities and act somewhat autonomously of the United States. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it does have the implication of cutting Britain out of sort of both spheres, right? So Britain is no longer as connected to the United States, and it also no longer has as big a voice in European defense discussions. And that's where I think this could end up being somewhat problematic. You could end up with Britain basically being sort of a secondary partner to the United States within NATO, not really having a voice in European debates. And that's a big role, a big problem, I think, for the British government, and perhaps to a lesser extent for the American government.
Yeah, and that, it's such a pity in that regard because, I mean, Britain is so important to European defense capabilities. And I think the United States actually should be a huge booster of this. I don't love the term strategic autonomy. I wish the focus was on strategic capabilities. It's not that we want Europe to be, separate from the United States, but 30 years ago when the Cold War ended and the United States decided that, it was going to maintain and then enlarge NATO, one of the big factors in the United States staying with NATO and continuing its role in Europe was that it felt like it had to be in charge of European security. That the lesson of the 20th century was, when the United States disengaged after World War I, you ended up with World War II. And when it stayed engaged, West Europe stayed free and prosperous. And the idea was to expand on that after the end of the Cold War. And the war in Yugoslavia 30 years ago that Europe couldn't really do much about sort of added to that incentive that the United States should stay in charge of European security. And that's the role that NATO has provided it. In a world in which the United States is really focused more and more on the rise of Asia, the rise of China, its role in the Western Pacific, its allies there, its allies in Europe are important, but they're even more important if they can do more in their own neighborhood, if they can take on more of the burden in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, North Africa. And that means they need more strategic capability. And so, if that happens through the EU, I think the United States should be supportive, but we're a long way from it, and Brexit does complicate that.
Thanks. So we're in the final 10 minutes of our event here tonight. So we're going to start to wrap things up a little bit. I want to thank both Jim and Emma. We've got time for a few more questions, and I think we've got a nice little pathway here forward. So the first question in this round, we'll call it, comes from Charlie, and it's, how can we represent democracy with our government of the politicians, by the lobbyists, and for the corporations? Emma, why don't we start with you?
Do we have to? I think, that there is language about the military-industrial complex that gets very conspiratorial, right? And you read this online, and people go down rabbit holes about it. But the fact is that it was Dwight Eisenhower, former general, president of the United States, that actually coined the term military-industrial complex. He was going to call it military-industrial congressional complex, but that was too politically problematic, so he just shortened it to military-industrial. And he was pinpointing a real problem, which is that American defense capabilities are produced by companies that have a financial stake in keeping the defense budget high, that they're very good at scattering production across the states so that every congressman and every senator has an interest in keeping the defense budget high and keeping spending high. And this is a problem that we have had since Eisenhower pointed it out in the 1950s. It's not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon. And this is why, even though I am very skeptical about the notion that the Biden administration is going to reinvent foreign policy for the middle class, I welcome their focus on thinking more about what foreign policy can do for the American people, being more responsive to the needs of the American people, what Americans actually think we should do around the world. Because if you look at polling, there's a lot of places where we have troops fighting, where Americans mostly think we should bring them home. There are places where Americans think we should be less involved. There are places like new diplomatic initiatives that they think we should be more involved. So the idea of an administration that listens a little more to the general public and a little less to some of the sort of corporate lobbyists that often inform decision making, particularly on Capitol Hill, I find that that would be a welcome change.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point, because going out and justifying policy, I think, and being able to show people how the policies being pursued are affecting them personally are so critical. And I would just say, there've been a lot of unfortunate things that happened after the election, and I would say one of them is what we should have been able to do after the election in November was really celebrate American democracy. I mean, think what we had in November. We had a free and fair election with no fraud, an ability to combat whatever kind of external interference might have been tried, in which more people voted for the two candidates than ever before. I mean, in the middle of a pandemic. It's pretty amazing that we had this election with both candidates receiving so many votes during a pandemic, and that the states pulled it off. I mean, that these election officials in the states made it happen. And it should be a celebration, because it means that the American people, Democrats and Republicans, were engaged in the election. And, hopefully we will move to a period now where we do have higher and higher turnout, and that people have access, the ability to vote, that it's not suppressed, and that people, Democrats and Republicans, get out and vote and make their voices heard. And I just think that that's something that we, because of what happened in the aftermath of the election, and then the assault on the Congress as it was certifying the vote, the insurrection in the Capitol, we didn't really take the time to celebrate what had been achieved with the election last fall. And I hope that we can sort of look at that as a way of thinking about how people do make their voices heard.
Great. So following this line, you mentioned a lot tonight, foreign policy for the middle class. How do we make non-elites care about foreign policy? And I would add to that, realize that it does matter to their daily lives. And since this question comes from Ambassador Basora, who had very kind words about you, Jim, I think we'll start with you.
Well, first of all, thanks to the ambassador for the kind words. To me, this is one of the real challenges of an administration arguing that that's going to be the organizing principle of its foreign policy, because it's normal that it's the elites who focus on foreign policy. You know, we elect representatives to represent us so that we don't have to be engaged all the time. That's the whole point of having this representative system that we have. They can take care of it for us, and most of what happens, you know, is fairly invisible. And so I think that I don't necessarily think it's the case that we have to have people who aren't involved in doing foreign policy engaged with it all the time. But it is clear that people need to feel that they have a stake in the policies that the U.S. is pursuing, that they have a way to make their voices heard. And I do think that's largely going to be through the Congress. And I think on issues, Emma mentioned the endless wars, you know, how will policy toward Afghanistan be made? It's really quite it's quite uncertain right now what the Biden administration policy is going to be toward Afghanistan, for example. And how do the American people feel about that, a war that's been going on for 2 decades? Do they still think the United States should still be there, or do they think the United States should leave? I think it's important that there be some effort to engage the population on this, to really have a good understanding of this. And I think that's largely going to be through their representatives in Congress.
Emma, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I would just caution against. I think there's been a bit of a tendency in Washington since 2016 to talk about, because if you remember, if you cast your mind back 4 years, Donald Trump was the one in 2016 saying things that were very unusual about foreign policy, right? Saying that the Iraq War was a mistake, saying that we shouldn't be fighting stupid wars overseas. He didn't end up doing any of that, but he was the one that said those things. And so there was a lot of attention in Washington after 2016 to how elites could convince the American people that what we were doing in foreign policy was in their interest, right? You know, so can think tanks send people out to Oklahoma City and conduct lectures to explain to people why everything we're doing in foreign policy is for their own good, for lack of a better term. And that is not the right way to frame this, right? This, if the American people are skeptical about how we approach foreign policy, and I think there's strong support in many areas, strong support for US alliances, for example, for the most part. But there's a deep skepticism about the defense budget, a deep skepticism about wars in the Middle East, a deep skepticism about sanctions in a lot of cases. And we need to think about why that's the case, right? So Washington foreign policy elites cannot just go and try and lecture the American people on foreign policy. They need to look at why people mostly think these things and say, hey, maybe we're getting it wrong. Can we find a way to understand why people see these problems differently than foreign policy elites, and understand that this might actually be a valuable perspective to be folded into policymaking?
Yeah, in other words, don't treat people as if they're stupid. Listen to what they're saying and try to understand where they're coming from, because they have important insights that need to be shared with people who are making these policies.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can sneak in one final question before we end here, and I think this wraps up what we were just talking about really nicely. So, how do we move the discussion of foreign affairs away from the idea that it's only about wars and national security? As all of the questions we've gotten in here today show. There's a lot to talk about in foreign policy, a lot of interest in it. So how do we get away from this idea that it's simply just about national defense? Emma, why don't we finish up with you?
Yeah, one idea that I very much welcome seeing from the Biden team, and that really shot through the discussions in the Democratic primary last year of foreign policy, was this notion that American foreign policy has become incredibly unbalanced, that we use the military tool far too often, and that even when it's not about fighting wars, that we have become so dependent on the Defense Department to do a lot of things that we used to depend on the State Department or USAID or other agencies to handle, that our foreign policy has basically become almost entirely about the military tool. And so, I very much welcome the sort of the statements that we've seen from the Biden campaign and administration on rebuilding the State Department in order to emphasize diplomacy as a tool of foreign policy, on talking more about foreign aid, multilateral engagement. We need to think more about the ways that we can engage with the world without it necessarily being about the military. I think for a long time, foreign policy has been portrayed as this, either you're in with the military fighting the wars or you're out and you're an isolationist. And that's not true. There are so many ways to engage with the world, to solve problems together that don't involve the military tool. What I think is uncertain right now, or is unknown right now, is the extent to which the Biden administration will walk the walk on that question. Will they actually follow through? Will they rebuild the State Department? Will they empower our diplomats? Will they draw down on the military tool? And I'm hopeful that they will, but we'll see over the next few years.
Yeah, and I would just close by saying, this is all so important, and it's really also a matter of what Congress will fund. Can you convince Congress that, we should be shifting dollars away from defense? And remember that, a lot of these defense dollars go to communities where jobs are the result of those defense dollars. So that's an important consideration here. But how do you get the State Department? How do you get the proper funding for the State Department, USAID, and these other agencies that are so critical for diplomacy and development? That is going to be quite a task for the Biden administration.
So it sounds like a solution to a lot of our issues is for people who are here tonight watching and who will be watching this recording to talk to your congressional members, tell them that foreign policy is important to you and something that we need to focus on, and share with them why you believe that the way foreign policy has been going either works for you or doesn't. So thank you, Jim. Thank you, Emma, for joining us here tonight. I think this was a great discussion. I wish we had more time to get to all of the wonderful questions that we have, but I want to thank you both for giving us your time and for sharing your insights.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone who joined us here tonight. We hope that you enjoyed our conversation and that you found it useful and helpful. We got through a lot, still a lot more to work our way through as we move through the year. We do want to mention that our next event will be March 8th, which is International Women's Day. We will have a panel of 3 women leaders from New Hampshire who are running international organizations right here in the state. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. Also on March 24th, we will be hosting a session on the strategic competition between China and US as they both work to exert their power around the world. So we hope that you save those dates on your calendar. We do have registration up on our website. Thank you again for everything you do to support our work and make this a great opportunity to discuss these important foreign issues. Have a wonderful night, and we hope to see you on the 8th. Thanks so much.